Christus regnat, Christus imperat.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Well, today we celebrate the feast of Saint Henry II, King of Germany and Holy Roman Emperor. He's one of those I don't know what you call it, long line of saints which disprove the evil of the world, so to speak, or rather proves the truth of the Catholic Church. Not only the Church, but all of her old traditions and disciplines. For this emperor, this king, would eventually, at the end of his life, give up his royal power, all of the pomp and circumstance of court, and want to become a lowly Benedictine monk. But I get ahead of myself, St. Henry II. He was born in the year 973. He was born to Duke Henry II of Bavaria. And young Henry was at first educated to become a cleric. And this was at the insistence of Otto II, who was the current Holy Roman Emperor. Now, Otto didn't have any really pious plans for young Henry. He wanted as few rivals to the throne as possible. So, and ended up being very good for young Henry. So he was fully invested in becoming a cleric. He was going to become a monk as a young man. He was educated, had a great philosophy, great theology, very pious young man. However, unexpectedly, Otto II died and left the succession of the empire open for dispute. And as you can imagine, Henry, wasn't so interested himself, but a lot of other people were interested in Henry becoming emperor. And so kind of in that context, he was convinced you need to do this for the good of the kingdom, etc. And we, it's good for us to see that the saints don't always start out as saints. So Henry II, he does see that possibility for power, and he decides to take it. And this, I would say, this is a good example of that. I would say that saying. Thomas à Kempis says in The Imitation of Christ, "We do not know what we are until adversity shows us." Very true. We also do not know what we are until opportunity shows us. And none of us know what we would do had we the opportunity to suddenly become powerful, wealthy, very influential. Would we take it? Would we be able to resist? We don't know. Opportunity hasn't shown us. So young Henry II sees this opportunity, and he leaves aside his clerical path and embarks on the path of politics. So he did begin to undertake a lot of political maneuvering and even military action, and he succeeds in holding the imperial title. He does succeed in kind of being the first contender of the claim to emperor, Holy Roman Emperor. At one point, he even briefly imprisoned an archbishop for refusing to support his endeavors. So, little, not so pious action of young man Henry there. But thankfully, his ambitions were tempered by a good marriage to Saint Cunegunda. She's the patron saint of Lithuania and Luxembourg, and her feast day is March 3rd. She had made a vow of virginity prior to the marriage, and she told this to St. Henry ahead of time, and in keeping with his, he kind of from a young man had resolved he was going to be a cleric, so marriage was not in his mind. But he agreed to the marriage anyways, because that would be very useful for him. We can get married. And it was very political, pressured, you need to have a good marriage, you need to have a wife or an empress. So he agreed to this kind of political marriage. It was, she had taken a vow of virginity, that was fine with him. But she kind of re-sparked that pious fervor he had as a young man. And despite his, very ambitious political maneuverings, and the fact that the marriage was mostly political to begin with, the two of them ended up becoming very good friends. And so eventually, King Henry II made Cunegunda his most trusted advisor and counselor, to whom he gave extensive decision-making power. And over time, she was very instrumental in influencing her husband to make great donations of land and funding for the building monasteries and convents. So much for the patriarchal, anti-feminist attitude of the Middle Ages. You see this all the time. All the time. Women are given incredible power and influence, and it's not because they, were furious and went into a rage and demanded it. It's because they were good women. They had virtue, they had devotion, they had honor, they had beauty, they had femininity, and it just drives men crazy. They love that, and they give women anything they want. That's good, right? Because she's virtuous. What she wants is good. So, you want to be treated like a princess? Act like a queen, or whatever. So, eventually, Henry was indeed named Holy Roman Emperor after 12 years as King of Germany. And it came about by the Pope Benedict VIII crowned King Henry Emperor. Now this was, we don't realize, this is kind of going back in history. This is a huge moment, a huge turning point in history. So this is going to be, I didn't write the date down. It's going to be somewhere around the year 1000. Right? Sometime around that turning of the first millennium. Until then, the popes had to ask the Byzantine emperor, hey, we've just elected this guy pope. Do we have your blessing and your approval? And the Byzantine emperor would say, yes, I approve this man as pope. And that was that way for hundreds of years. And you had a couple of exceptions in there. But the popes were very much subject to the power and influence of the emperor, or whoever the ruler was. And in fact, Benedict VIII had been driven out of Rome by the current ruler of the region. That was, who was that? I can't remember. It was one of the, John Crescentius was the governor of Rome. He had total political power. He imprisoned Benedict VIII and then banished him, set up his own anti-pope in Rome in place of the rightful Pope Benedict VIII. Henry II marched an army down to Rome, drove out John Crescentius, reinstated Benedict VIII as Pope. And then what happened? Henry II didn't demand anything from the Pope. He put his army and himself at the service of the Pope. The Pope crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. He was sending the message, the king is under the Pope. Even emperors are not greater than the vicar of Christ on earth. So a huge moment in church history, and that would be very influential in shaping, practically speaking, not the separation of church and state, but the cooperation of church and state. The state needs to cooperate with the church in the salvation of man. We may not think that, but that's true, because Christ is king of the whole world, and everything in the world needs to be ordered and subordinate to Christ's wishes and desires. Christ wills the salvation of all men. Every government needs to will the salvation of all men in their proper sphere. So Henry II was instrumental in, practically speaking, putting that into effect, recognizing it, realizing it, and paving the way for later theologians to use this as an example. And in fact, some of the examples are a synod was held in Rome shortly afterwards, where decrees were made outlawing simony, promoting clerical chastity, restoring church lands that had been unlawfully seized by power-hungry barons and dukes and so on. And Henry, Holy Roman Emperor, he had the imperial power to back up the decrees of the Pope. And so he made it happen. That's that cooperation of church and state. So, by this time, it's been many, many years, several decades, and Henry had become, sincerely overcome any more aspirations to ambition. Partly it's because once you have power, you realize it's not all it's cracked up to be. And the thing is, any time you have anything like this, power, wealth, ambition, pleasure, it's never enough, right? How much power does an ambitious man want? More. How much wealth does a miser want? More. Right? How much pleasure does a hedonist want? He wants more. He doesn't want this much or that much. Well, if I just had, how many $1 billion? It doesn't matter. All the money in the world is never enough. The miser, the avaricious man wants more. And Henry came to see that. He had everything he wanted, everything he desired. And it's just, you know what? I was happier as a young man when I was in that monastery and as a young monk. I was happier. I was closer to God. That was such an easier life. He realized that is the better life. So what did he do? He gave everything away. He went to a Benedictine monastery and he told the abbot, I want to enter. The abbot, of course, is like, you're the emperor. You can't be a monk. And Henry was trying to tell him this. This is all I want. I want to enter. I want to be a lowly monk. It's better. And the abbot is like, I'm sorry, I can't let you enter. So Henry says, as your emperor, I order you to allow me entrance into this monastery. The abbot, of course, himself being a humble man, agrees and says, okay, as your subject, I accept you into the monastery. Henry is very pleased with this. And then he says, and now I, as your abbot, order you to become emperor. So it was, catch-22. So Henry realizes, okay, he can't escape it, and he's a good emperor, right? The abbot knows this. We're not going to get a better emperor than you. You need to remain. You're doing God's work. Stay where you are, even though it's displeasing to you. And I've said this in other sermons, right? Especially for the busy moms. You spend all that time out there in that hallway in purgatory, with all your kids, and you're like, if I just didn't have all these kids, I could be there in church. I could be so holy. You are holy. You're getting holy. You're doing what you're supposed to do. That is your place for now. It's not going to last forever, even though it feels like it. One day, after having 15 kids, there'll be no more, and your purgatory is over. At least that purgatory. So it's the same way, right? We may feel like I'm not getting the prayers that I want. I'm not doing but sacrifice that. There is a merit in sacrificing, quiet and contemplative time in prayer, sacrificing that to do something for others if that's your state in life. There's merit in that. So don't be afraid. I've given this advice before, right? If you can't do your prayers and you can't do your devotions, don't let that agitate you. Just trade it. Trade it for whatever's bothering and irritating you. That's the better prayer anyways, accepting with peace and resignation whatever happens to me outside my control. That's a better prayer than if I blow my stack because I can't get my rosary in, or I couldn't do my spiritual reading and now I feel guilty. Forget about it. Just make the trade, and that's better prayer. So he eventually, Emperor Henry, would die in the year 1024 after suffering from a grave illness at the age of 51. His wife Cunegunda would survive, but she was left quite poor. She had given away all the personal wealth that they had possessed, and so when her husband, the emperor, died, she was really had nothing. And of course, with all the other political scheming, she herself did not continue as empress. She wouldn't have wanted that anyways. And of course, they had no children. They were celibate. She simply retired to a convent. And she ended up living as a Benedictine nun herself for the next 15 years, devoting herself to works of charity. So what a great life of Emperor Henry II. And again, it didn't start out good. He started out as a monk, and he left behind that way of life to pursue power and ambition. Thankfully, and that wasn't his only goal. There was noble motives at play, but that was certainly a part of it. So he ended up accomplishing God's will, even though it wasn't perfectly God's will from the beginning. Like, he didn't perfectly want God's will. He was imprisoning archbishops to gain power. Actually, that might not be a bad idea these days. But, God can work with that. God can work with even our imperfect desires. And yes, I'm doing kind of the right thing, but kind of not for a really good reason. God can work with that. He can work with that. And the people he sends us in life, our spouses, the people we know, we need to let them influence us for the better. We need to be influenced by others and not look at what they do to us, but what their good example is. And that's what he and his wife did for each other. He ended up using his power for the sake of others. He ended up supporting the Pope, with the state. He ended up doing a lot of good despite his early mistakes. So let us not be ourselves discouraged by any mistakes we may have made earlier in life, or perhaps, people are paralyzed. What if I don't do the right thing? Oh no, is this God's will? Should I do this or that? I have to do God's will perfectly. No, you don't. Right? He can work very much with even an imperfect will. So if you make the wrong decision, if you choose the wrong path in life, God can work with that. He can work with an imperfect decision early on and make you a saint. So don't let yourself fall into scruples. Don't let yourself fall into despair. Don't fall into complacency either, right? He really worked. He said his prayers. He remained faithful to God, and God turned him into a saint. He can do the same for us no matter what our circumstances. Let us keep that in mind and pray to King St. Henry for his intercession. God bless you all. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Thank you for listening. Please remember to click subscribe and to hit the bell for notifications. And in this age of censorship, please consider helping support us at sensusfidelium.com. Under the Donate and Support tab, there are plenty of ways to help support the work and to help grow and sustain the efforts of Sensus Fidelium in general. May God reward you, and thank you very much.